However they may have defined, interpreted, or accounted for them, moralists from Socrates to the present have generally been in agreement in assigning to ideals a central place in ethics. If man were perfect, no ethical questions would arise and ethical theory would be non-existent. It is only because man is imperfect and yet capable of formulating and aspiring to the realization of ideals that either practical or theoretical questions of an ethical nature arise. Much of the recent discussion of ethical ideals has concerned itself with the question of definition and validation. Thus, for example, in contemporary Anglo-American moral philosophy, much attention has been given to the status of moral judgments. Some exponents of the so-called emotive theory of ethics have insisted that discussion of such issues transpire at a meta-ethical level and hence do not concern specific moral norms. It is questionable whether any such neat separation of normative ethical theory from meta-ethical theory can be maintained. But whatever be said on this question, it is clear that many of the exponents of the emotivist theory agree with the advocates of cognitivist theories, which they oppose, in regarding ethical ideals as intrinsically realizable. Or to put the matter in less controversial fashion, neither party has seen fit to call into question either the realizability of ethical ideals or the sincerity of the individual who attempts to realize them. Both parties to the current dispute pride themselves in leaving ordinary morality pretty much untouched. In fact, the issue often turns on the question whether or not the proffered analysis of ethical statements is faithful to what we ordinarily or really mean. Neither side has any desire to overturn or even seriously to revise conventional morality. Only if, as the proponents of the cognitivist theory maintain, the meta-ethical theory of the emotivists is incompatible with ordinary ethical language and practice, is conventional morality threatened. And this charge has yet to be substantiated. The point I wish to make is that in spite of heated controversy as to the way in which ethical language is to be interpreted, the dispute has not seriously called into question the validity of ethics itself as a project. Two fundamental questions, namely A, whether ethical ideals are realizable, and B, whether the pursuit of ethical ideals can be undertaken in good faith, have hardly been raised. At the same time that their colleagues across the Channel and the Atlantic have been so hotly engaged in disputes about ethical language, philosophers on the continent have been raising more radical questions about the validity of ethics as a project. Hegel was perhaps the first to question the possibility of realizing ethical ideals, and even more, of the sincerity involved in attempting to realize them. His critique of Kant's ethical theory was not so much a criticism of Kant's ethical formulations as of Kant's failure to reflect adequately upon the character of the ethical enterprise as such. Unlike Kant, Hegel looked upon the human subject as an elaborately complex dialectical entity, which in positing virtue inevitably posits its opposite vice. With brilliant irony and satire, Hegel sought to exhibit the naive optimism and piety reflected in the conventional view of good and evil. For quite a different reason than for Kant, Hegel saw morality as necessarily leading to religion. The task which ethics sets for itself is intrinsically unrealizable within the ethical sphere. The ethical man is doomed to live in a state of frustration and partial self-deception, to exhibit what Hegel termed an unhappy consciousness. Before considering subsequent developments of the dialectical conception of morality, it is important to take note of earlier but different views of the unrealizability of ethical ideals. Plato had, of course, insisted that all ideals have a transcendent character and are incapable of perfect realization in a temporal world. The ethical ideal was, for Plato, intrinsically unrealizable because of the nature of the ideal, on the one hand, and of the human self on the other. But this did not imply, on Plato's view, that ethical ideals could not be approximated. One might approach ever closer to the perfect achievement of any given ideal, even though he could never perfectly embody it. Thus, the impossibility of a perfect realization of the ideal did not, for Plato, imply either that it could not be achieved in degree, or that to pursue ideals plunges the individual into bad faith. In spite of all the hazards to the achievement of moral virtue, some of which are in the nature of the case insurmountable, one could pursue it single-mindedly and with unambiguous commitment. Moral failure is due in part to the intrinsic unrealizability of the ethical ideal, but also to ignorance, weakness, and the intransigent character of the empirical world. In one form or another, this conception of the ethical ideal as unambiguous, if transcendent, tended to prevail in Western moral philosophy to modern times. Kant made explicit reference to Plato in expanding his own conception of ideals. Like Plato, Kant regarded them as having a transcendent reference, a status which inspires both respect and awe. Kant never, so far as I know, suggested that the moral ideal is incapable of realization by man, but he had serious and confessed doubts as to whether any man had realized or would ever perfectly realize the ideal of moral conscientiousness. There is more than a suggestion of the Platonic conception of virtue in Kant's recognition that the human lifespan may not be sufficient to achieve perfect virtue. But if Kant was, on the one hand, a Platonist in his conception of virtue, he departed from the Platonic tradition in his conception of duty. The perfection appropriate to morality is the faithful performance of duty. But precisely here lies a difference as well as a difficulty. For the perfection of man is not the perfection of God. Whereas duty is the central factor of morality and thus constitutes the virtue of the morally perfect man, God knows nothing of duty. It follows from the Kantian analysis that the very condition which makes morality possible establishes its ultimate limit. Great as the possible perfection of the morally good man is, we can imagine a higher perfection. Duty, which is the supreme principle of human morality on Kant's view, is the mark also of its imperfection. Although this fact never seems to have troubled Kant, it provided a sufficient ambiguity to attract the attention of Hegel and subsequent dialectically oriented thinkers. They sought to determine whether duty, as Kant represents it, may not be an imperfect and highly ambiguous ideal. If Greek moral philosophy did not recognize anything ambiguous about the ethical situation, such was not the case for the other major strand in the Western ethical tradition. The Hebraic Christian tradition had been concerned from the first about the ambiguity of human motivation and the purity of man striving after ideals. Since the morally conscientious man tends to absolutize the law which he has set for himself, his first temptation is the idolatry of the humanly conceived moral law. This tendency received its most extreme expression at the hands of the Pharisees, who carried the scrupulous observance of the law to its limit. The biblical prophets, curiously enough, found themselves arrayed not simply against the licentious and profligate, but increasingly against the morally scrupulous. However universal and objective, the canons of human morality cannot escape relativity. In the last analysis, the moral law can be validated only by human reason, as both Kant and the biblical prophets knew full well. Kant sought a way out of this dilemma by appeal to what he called pure reason, but it is questionable whether even the deliverances of pure reason can altogether escape the charge of relativity, not to this or that culture, to be sure, but to human reason in general. Now there's a second difficulty to be found in legalistic morality, which is not to be avoided, incidentally, by recourse to formalism. The difficulty consists in the inescapable tendency for the moral law to displace the proper object of moral concern. It tends to displace it in two directions. A, so as to center attention upon the virtue of the conscientious individual, and B, so as to regard the other person as only a case falling under the law. In other words, the morally conscientious man wills to aid his fellow man in case of distress because such an action conforms to the law and hence will enhance his own virtue, rather than because the other person directly requires and merits his aid. A morality of law thus inevitably tends toward self-righteousness on the one hand, and toward an abstract relatedness to other persons on the other hand. It is not a question here of the impossibility of a perfect realization of the ideal of morality, but rather of intrinsic difficulties involved in any degree of moral perfection. To be aware of the law and to stand under the law is already to be alienated from oneself and others. To fulfill the law is to resolve the initial problem only at the price of positing another difficulty of equal, if not greater, seriousness. Even the purest moral will is seen to reflect fundamental ambiguities, and morality to exhibit a measure of bad faith. The question, then, is not simply whether the ideal of morality is transcendent in scope, and thus not completely or perfectly realizable, but whether any degree of realization may not involve the individual in bad faith. Is there a dialectical problem confronting the enterprise of morality such that the realization of its ideal in any degree necessarily entails the frustration of its projected goal? And if this is the case, to what source is the difficulty to be attributed? Does it perhaps stem from the dialectical character of human existence itself, as some of the existentialists have maintained? It is to the consideration of this question that we must now turn our attention. In spite of their celebrated differences with Hegel, the existentialist philosophers are deeply indebted to him for their dialectical conception of the human self. They offer a solid front against the classical naturalistic conception of man as having a fixed essence. Man is, on their view, fundamentally in process, a project. He is in large measure what he wills to become, and yet he does not create himself ex nihilo, but must contend always with the factual necessities of his existence. The life of man is distended between these two poles of necessity and possibility. In willing to be a self, as Kierkegaard represents it, the individual moves in the direction of possibility and toward the ideal. He wills to be that which he is not but might become. And in so willing, he negates himself as a mere factually determined natural creature with specific characteristics. As Kierkegaard portrays the plight of man, he is confronted with the task of trying to overcome the basic polarity of his existence so as to effect a higher synthesis. But this he can never do. The condition of man, insofar as he seeks to provide from himself the solution to the problem of existing, is, as Kierkegaard views it, despair. With brilliant psychological penetration, Kierkegaard exposed the bad faith which follows as the natural concomitant of idealism. The individual who aspires to be a perfect self aspires to a possibility and hence to an ideal which does not characterize his actual existence. The purer the form of the ideal which he entertains, the greater the distance between what he is in actuality as a man living in the world and what he aspires to become. The more passionately he aspires to the ideal, the more he comes to love his projected ideal self and to despise the deficient actual self. He may literally come to hate himself because of his failure to be what he ought to be. This self-hatred is at the foundation of some forms of neurotic self-abasement, as Karen Horney has pointed out. Because he hates his actual and deficient self, the individual may and often does undertake to punish himself, sometimes in extreme ways. He may go out of his way to solicit vituperation and abuse from others in his desire to satisfy his self-hatred. Precisely because he has become so devoted to the idealized image of himself, he comes to despise himself as an existing person. Now, it is important to avoid a confusion here. It is not the case that a neurotic self-hate is at the bottom of a false self-idealization, but rather that a self-idealization carried to its logical conclusion is at the foundation of a typical neurosis. The individual who aspires to be perfect is surely not for that reason alone neurotic, though his aspiration to perfection may, if unqualified, be the source of neurotic behavior. If, as Kierkegaard maintains, no one can become a self without moving in the direction of ideal possibility, and if, further, to aspire to ideals with unqualified seriousness is to despair over oneself, the problem is one that confronts all morally conscientious men. The fact that not all or even the larger proportion of men take their ideals seriously in no way alters the picture. It remains that insofar as they do take them seriously, they are faced with the possibility of self-hate and despair. Now, confronted with this sort of dilemma, one alternative would be to compromise one's ideals, and I suppose this is what we usually do. One might, for example, be content to be only a fairly honest man rather than a completely honest man, a moderately courageous, generous, or just person rather than the perfect embodiment of these virtues. This is, in fact, what most people do. They are content to approximate the ideal in varying degrees. But to be content with such an approximation is not in itself a solution to the moral problem involved, but rather the abandonment of the moral enterprise. Or if not its abandonment, it surely involves holding on to the moral ideal in a condition of bad faith. Honesty is a good thing, to a degree, and it is precisely in the qualification to a degree that bad faith enters in. For honesty, or any other ideal for that matter, is then endowed with a fundamental ambiguity such that it is both good and not good, a virtue and a vice. It is not a question here of moderation or of a mean between extremes, but of a mean between virtue and vice, which Aristotle explicitly repudiated. If this way out is chosen, the question is, on what moral grounds can it be justified? The conscientious individual may reject the alternative of compromise in order to avoid unbearable tension within himself and choose instead to despair over his weakness. Realizing that he cannot make of himself a perfect man in all respects, possibly in no respect at all, he may elect to maintain his ideals while lamenting over his imperfect condition. All of us are familiar with such lamentation over moral weakness in ourselves and others. But what we often fail to note is that, as Kierkegaard points out, the individual who thus laments over his weakness is not honest with himself. This very weakness is so dear to him that he dare not rid himself of it. For to be rid of his weakness would be to give up the very thing which makes possible his elevated conception of himself as a perfect man. It is, in other words, through the weakness that the ideal is posited, further through the weakness alone that the ideal is maintained. The individual can be the perfect self which he has projected only through not being it, namely through the weakness of his actual existence. If he were to be rid of his weakness, he would at the same time be deprived of his elevated ideal. He would, in fact, be required to admit the impossibility of his ideal and the bad faith involved in identifying himself with it. What often appears as abnormal and neurotic behavior in the case of a person who laments over his weakness and does little or nothing to overcome it is understandable enough in the light of his projected ideal. Such an individual has projected for himself not an approximately perfect self, but an unqualifiedly perfect self. Only by holding on to and even nurturing his weakness can he avoid the admission that his project is impossible of realization. Rather than compromise his ideal, he laments over his weakness and is, as Kierkegaard describes it, in conscious despair. Viewed psychologically, his suffering is neurotic, since it is self-chosen and avoidable. It has no objective ground, but stems from the ethical orientation of the person. Kierkegaard's analysis sheds new light on many aspects of abnormal and neurotic behavior, and perhaps on some forms of psychotic behavior. Binswanger and others of the school of existential or phenomenological psychoanalysis have made fruitful use of this mode of analysis in explaining abnormal behavior patterns. With Kierkegaard, they look to the world design of the individual, including his ethical project, as a guide for the understanding of his life history. For Kierkegaard, there are several forms of despair. Despair at not willing to be a self, and despair in willing to be oneself. But all forms of despair have this in common, that they represent attempts to do the impossible and hence involve some measure of self-deception. The plight of man is, on Kierkegaard's view, that the individual can neither reject any one pole of the multiple oppositions in his existence, nor effect a stable synthesis of the opposites. If the goal of ethical striving is autonomy, as Kant had claimed, then, as Kierkegaard represents it, it is impossible to escape despair in the domain of the ethical. Because he has not created himself, but is posited by God, man cannot provide a sufficient foundation or justification for his existence. The project of ethics will, if consistently carried through, lead him ever deeper into despair. The original and intrinsic negativity of the finite self necessarily infects any ethical project which it sets for itself. Every type of ethical striving has its appropriate form of despair, and to be in despair is to be in bad faith, since one can be in despair only through willing it. Although Sartre uses ontological rather than religious categories, his account of bad faith has much in common with Kierkegaard's analysis of despair. They differ not so much in their statement of the problem as in the solution. Whereas Kierkegaard offers the promise of redemption through religious faith, Sartre sees no possibility of an ultimate escape from man's dialectical predicament. In place of despair, Sartre substitutes a kind of numbed futility. Man cannot realize his own projects nor justify himself, and yet he is doomed ever to try. The very uselessness of freedom is employed by Sartre in such a way as to reflect upon its sublimity. Human life is in its most ambitious undertakings vain and futile, but nonetheless, and even for that reason, glorious. As Sartre terms it in typical paradoxical fashion, the self is what it is not, and is not what it is. It can become itself only through an act of annihilation. It must make itself to be, and that which it makes itself to be always takes the form of a project. Because of the fundamental negativity which infects all aspects of human existence, the self is ambiguous and problematic at all levels of its behavior. It is this ontologically grounded ambiguity which gives rise to bad faith on Sartre's analysis. Whatever man claims to be or not to be, his claim must be partially false in that he can be it only by not being it, or not be it only by being it. For example, the honest man is honest only by negating the constant temptation to dishonesty. It is impossible for him to be an honest man in such a way that honesty is constitutive of his existence. He must constantly strive to make himself honest in the face of the possibility of dishonesty. The more scrupulous he is about being honest, the more he testifies to the effort and concentration required to maintain this virtue. If asked whether or not he is an honest man, the proper answer would be yes and no. Insofar as dishonesty, even the most radical act of dishonesty, remains a possibility for him at every minute, he cannot claim to be an honest man without qualification. Nor could he ever become an unqualifiedly honest man. Even as the courageous man must constantly overcome his own fears, so the honest man must constantly overcome the possibility of deception and dissemblance. If we follow Kierkegaard, it is only irony and humor which make it possible to sustain such an ambiguity in seriousness. The alternative is fanaticism, namely the futile attempt to eliminate the ambiguity by the overzealous affirmation of one element. For the humorless man, the ambiguity is intolerable. The fact, however, that no one can ever be unqualifiedly virtuous does not mean that good faith and bad faith become a matter of indifference. Although there is an inescapable element of bad faith involved in the most dedicated conscientiousness, there is still a great difference between this sort of good faith and the kind of cynicism which makes no effort to preserve the unity and integrity of the human self. Neither bad faith nor good faith is possible apart from its opposite, though either may provide the dominant motif in existence. If good faith is a qualified sincerity, bad faith is a qualified insincerity. Both involve truth as well as deception, though either the will to truth or deception may constitute the ruling factor. But this does not suffice. For the morally conscientious man seeks not the least amount of insincerity, but perfect sincerity. He wants to be honest, courageous, just, or benevolent in an unqualified and unambiguous way. Yet, if Sartre is correct, this goal can never be achieved or even approximated. In Sartre's analysis, a great deal depends upon the temporal modality of the human self. For Sartre, as for all of the existentialist writers from Kierkegaard on, the primary category pertaining to human existence is that of becoming. Human existence is not a given datum so much as a task, something to be achieved through choice and action. This means, in the first place, that until death has overtaken the self, one's ideal remains projective in character and hence, in the nature of the case, unrealizable. Death does not affect the completion of the projects of the self, but only brings an end to the process of striving. The self is not so much completed as stopped by death, and stopped at whatever point of incompleteness happened to characterize it at a given time. After death, there are no more projects, but neither is there any longer a self. A dead self is not a perfected self, but a finished self. The future constitutes an essential form of self-transcendence. Without this dimension, one could not be self-conscious, nor exist in the uniquely human mode of being for oneself. Once realized, what was once a future project of the self becomes a factually determined characteristic. The achieved project characterizes the self in the present or the past. I am now being honest, or I have been honest, but so long as I exist, I cannot be identical with my being as present, as past, or as future. The self cannot exist simply in the mode of pastness or presentness any more than it can exist solely in the mode of futurity. This means that the project fails to characterize the self unqualifiedly, even in the process of being realized. There is, in other words, an important sense in which I am not the honest man who is now standing by the truth, or who has in the past been faithfully truthful. Thus, what I wanted in seeking to realize my ethical project is not and cannot be achieved. I wanted it as a result, a fixed achievement, a possession which would add luster to myself, provide a permanent characterization of what I am. But this I cannot have. Moral achievement becomes a vanishing quantity which evaporates under my hand. It is not simply that the self is projected into the future that makes the realization of ideals impossible, but the further fact that it cannot be simply identical with itself, either as past or as present. But there is a further complicating factor which follows from the above limitation. Insofar as I have become determinate through the realization of my projects, this determination itself becomes problematic for me. Insofar as I transcend my own past and my present situation, I am free, at least in part, to determine what these determinations will mean to me. My past is ever being enriched by new decisions and new action. And yet, nothing is more problematic to an individual than his own past, up to and including the freshest item in it. I may now regret the price which my virtuous action exacted from me, a not uncommon reaction. This accounts, I suppose, for the occasional shame which may be evoked by praise for virtuous action. Manifest guilt or shame on the occasion of achievement, virtuous achievement, is by no means a rare phenomenon in human experience. The achievement of virtue, as well as the failure to achieve it, poses a problem for the individual. Even when it has become a factual determination of his character, virtue enjoys an ambiguous status. The ethical task, then, is doubly problematic in that it involves not only the individual's relation to himself, but his appearance to others. Kierkegaard proposes subjective truth as the paramount ethical virtue. To exist in the mode of subjective truth is to be absolutely sincere. Yet, in advocating indirect communication as necessary for the preservation of subjective truth, Kierkegaard allows for the possibility of dissemblance. It is not always clear whether Kierkegaard regarded indirect communication and some measure of dissemblance as the inevitable and necessary consequence of inwardness, or as a necessary condition for the development and preservation of inwardness. He seems at times to have taken both positions, implying that one ought not to communicate his innermost thoughts, feelings, etc., directly, even if it were possible to do so. The more interesting question for our purposes is whether or not direct communication is possible. If it is not possible, then dissemblance is a necessary feature of human communication. But if dissemblance in relation to others is unavoidable, how can pure subjective truth be maintained? Can one, in other words, avoid self-deception if he is necessarily involved in the deception of others? Kierkegaard was not really concerned about the relation of the individuals to others, save insofar as it presents a problem, as it presents a possible threat to one's inwardness. It is evident that not only in abstract terms, but with respect to his personal life, Kierkegaard was greatly concerned about the threat to subjectivity. Marriage would clearly have put a great strain upon Kierkegaard's sense of privacy. He records that he attempted and apparently succeeded in carrying out an elaborate and extended deception of Regina, the girl to whom he was engaged, carrying it to what must strike his readers as comic proportions. Whether or not it fulfilled the intended purpose of disguise and concealment, it clearly served to bewilder and befuddle her. On his own testimony, it did not succeed in provoking the sort of indirect self-disclosure which he sought from her, for Regina failed to respond as required by Kierkegaard's design. His acting was largely lost upon her, even though it may have been absolutely necessary from his side. He certainly attempted to present himself as an enigma to the world, including those closest to him, and has remained highly enigmatical to his readers. But was this, as he thought, necessary for the achievement of subjective truth? The now frequent suggestion that Kierkegaard's behavior toward Regina was neurotic and even pathological misses the whole point. For if it was neurotic, it was because of Kierkegaard's projected ideal. Thus, the abnormality of his behavior needs to be understood in terms of his life plan, rather than his life plan in terms of any naturally caused or motivated abnormality. One question at issue here is whether in order to have for oneself an ethical project, one must engage in play acting and a measure of pretense. Kierkegaard affirms that we must do so, though for the purpose of screening one's inwardness from others. Sartre takes a more radical position, maintaining that one must engage in pretense even in relation to oneself. Hence, for Sartre, a pure objective truth is impossible. To be at all is to be in the mode of the for myself, the poursoir. It is to play at being what I project for myself as a goal. Thus, if I determine to be a waiter, to use Sartre's example, I must play at being a waiter, and to do so successfully must deceive myself by pretending to be only a waiter. To take the role seriously, without which the whole project fails and becomes a joke, as it often does, requires that I identify myself with the role. But for reasons which we have previously considered, such an attempt at identification immediately involves me in bad faith, since there are fundamental respects in which I am not and cannot be a waiter. If Sartre is right, the difference between the man who has devoted many years of his life to being a waiter and the individual who merely pretends to being a big game hunter without having tracked or shot a single wild animal is only relative. The difference is, I suppose, that in the former case one has played at something persistently to the extent that it has come to define an extensive part of one's facticity, whereas in the latter case one has only flirted with the role. But so far as absolute sincerity is concerned, one man is scarcely better off than the other. Or, if you prefer, neither can attain absolute sincerity, and hence must plead guilty to play acting and pretending. As a matter of fact, the danger of serious self-deception is all the greater in the case of the seasoned and aged waiter, for he may be more easily persuaded that he is simply a waiter. The pretended hunter knows that it is a pretense and is most likely prepared to treat it as a joke, whereas the waiter may be altogether humorless, seeing no possibility of dissemblance in human existence. One role is no better or no worse than another when judged by the criterion of absolute sincerity. All prove to be deficient and are relativized by the standard of perfect sincerity. To miss the mark by an inch is as good in this instance as missing it by a mile, for the question is not how close one can come, but whether or not the goal can be attained. Ethical demands are, as Sartre correctly points out, often of a self-contradictory nature in demanding perfect sincerity, complete identification of oneself with one's role, so that one may repent and reform. If the original complete sincerity which is demanded were possible, repentance and reform would be out of the question. Thus, moral improvement presupposes the very impossibility of perfect sincerity which it demands. To improve oneself at all, one must become what one is not and deny what one is. Sartre is surely correct in insisting that if morality makes room for repentance, it posits an intrinsic bad faith which seriously qualifies all ethical projects. Repentance requires the possibility of self-transcendence, but for the virtuous as well as the evil action. If I am not identical with myself in failing to do my duty, neither am I self-identical in the performance of duty. But one may ask, is there not something perverse about this attribution of intrinsic bad faith to the moral life? Have Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Sartre perhaps magnified and distorted factors which have long been recognized by moral theorists from Plato to Kant? Does the fact that the self is dialectical in the ways indicated above actually entail that ethics is beset with insurmountable dialectical problems? Can we not find a way around these difficulties by taking account of the modalities of human existence and their significance for ethical striving? Need the verdict for ethics be so negative as Kierkegaard and Sartre and others have suggested? Is there, in short, no positive alternative to a stalwart cynicism relieved only by irony and humor? As we have seen, the claim is that bad faith infects the moral life with respect both to social and personal virtue. In each case, the argument is predicated on the assumption that human life is a process of striving to achieve ideal ends, and that this striving is characterized by a fundamental dialectical tension. There are then really three basic questions before us. One, is man properly to be described as a dialectical being whose life process exhibits a tension of opposites? Secondly, if man is properly so described, does this entail that ethical life inevitably reflects these dialectical tensions? And thirdly, if the answer to the first two questions is affirmative, can the dialectical conflict within ethics be overcome within the compass of the ethical life? If the conflict cannot be overcome, the most viable alternatives would appear to be resignation, heroic cynicism, or religious faith. It is, I think, quite unnecessary to argue in support of the first proposition. If not demonstrated, the case for the understanding of man under dialectical categories has been extensively and persuasively argued by Hegel and the existentialist philosophers from Kierkegaard to Sartre. Moreover, there is well-established precedent for this view of man in classical philosophy. Socrates had made essentially the same point in his discussion of courage, and Plato had presented the radical character of human choice in dramatic terms. Insofar as the basic ontological categories of freedom and becoming characterize human existence, dialectical tension cannot fail to result. If this proposition be granted, the second proposition follows easily enough. Morality is itself seen to be, as Kant had presented it, an affair of human freedom, and hence essentially a project. If man is to become morally good, it can be only because he posits the ideal of moral virtue and strives to achieve it. He is not naturally good in the moral sense of the term, but can only become morally good. It follows, I believe, that if human life is intrinsically dialectical, this fact must qualify all human projects, including the ethical. To see this, we need only recognize that the task of becoming a morally good man is, after all, but a special case of the ultimate project of becoming a self. Ethical life has ontological significance for two reasons. First, that it represents the striving of an existing individual, and secondly, that it is itself an essential stage in the realization of human selfhood. The first consideration suggests that ethics must be understood ontologically as originating in and expressive of existence. The second consideration indicates that ethics is an essential phase of the ontological venture. We can, in other words, understand the possibility and necessity of ethics only in terms of a fundamental analysis of the being of man. Fundamental ontology is, in this sense, prior to ethics. And yet, ethics reveals an essential dimension of human reality which could not otherwise be discerned. Put in the simplest terms, man's attempt to be morally good, or good in any sense, falls under the ontological category of human becoming. In seeking to be morally good, man is, after all, only striving to become himself. When this fact is forgotten and ethics is regarded as sui generis, the moral life becomes unintelligible. It makes sense to ask the question, why be moral, provided one has not lost touch with the ontological foundation of ethical life. Man's ultimate problem is how he is to exist, how he is to be. This question lies at the foundation of all ethical questions, however concrete or specific. Now, I have not elected to argue the first thesis for reasons that I have indicated, and since I can't imagine that anyone would accept the first thesis without accepting the second as well, I will pass on quickly to the third proposition, which poses the special topic of my paper. The primary question is, then, whether ethical life can escape cynicism and despair, or, to put the question in different terms, whether moral idealism can be pursued in good faith. There are, as we have noted, many facets to the problem under consideration. It concerns not only the individual's relation to himself, but also his relatedness to other selves, to nature, and to God. The fact that he is both a being in himself as well as a being for himself poses a problem for his relation to others. And the additional fact that he is intrinsically a being for others, a social being, poses a problem for his self-relatedness. If it is difficult, if not impossible, for the individual to effect a coincidence of the in itself with the for itself, as Sartre following Hegel maintains, it is no less difficult for him to unify his being for others with his being for himself, or if you like, his social being with his personal and individual being. If we keep in mind the fact that the ethical project is part and parcel of the attempt to cope with the problem of existing in a world, we can readily see how the basic dialectical categories of existence inevitably intrude upon the ethical domain. The indictment of ethics we are considering argues that the ethical life necessarily posits an opposition between the universal particular, the actual ideal, eternal temporal, and necessary contingent. The difficulty which affects all ethical theories is, then, that ethical life generates self-contradictory principles. The argument is, I think, essentially sound insofar as man is properly regarded as a dialectical being, and insofar as ethics itself is looked upon as a response to the fundamental ambiguity of human existence. But the argument is telling only against moral theories, which attempt to define the moral good non-dialectically, as I think all naturalistic theories do. Insofar as bad faith refers only to antithetical elements within the ethical project, it is by no means a damning indictment of the ethical life. It is only when contrasted with overly simple characterizations of the ethical ideal that it implies cynical disillusionment. The ideal, the possible, and the future constitute only one aspect of the moral life. There is also the actual, the necessary, and the present, as well as the striving which relates them to their opposites. Initially, to raise the question of bad faith is only to point to the element of striving which characterizes the moral life. All ethical projects exhibit alienation and negativity, and hence deserve to be regarded as manifestations of what Hegel termed the unhappy consciousness. But that is only to say that ethical striving consists in the positing of goals and the attempt to achieve them. If one does not lose sight of the unity of the self which posits goals and the importance of the striving which relates actuality to ideality, no insurmountable problem arises. The ethical good cannot be adequately defined in terms of either of the opposed elements, but must include the opposition and the striving which holds them together. To apply this to one of Sartre's examples, there is no valid ethical requirement that one exhaust one's reality in the role of being a waiter. The individual is insincere and in bad faith if he refuses to regard the faithful performance of his job as essential. But he is in a more profound mode of bad faith if he essays to identify himself with such a role unqualifiedly. No fundamental self-deception is involved if one has an adequate conception of the significance of ordinary work within the total life of man. The ultimate demand is not to be a waiter in the mode of a robot, but to be a waiter who is also a person. And this is neither impossible nor a project of bad faith in any derogatory sense of that term. Or to consider another of Sartre's illustrations, that of human love. One need not pretend that he does or can exhaust his existence in his concrete love for another person. The ideal of love does not demand the sort of self-coincidence which constitutes the self as an object or a thing. Sartre makes his negative point by playing off the concept of bad faith against too simple and naive a view of sincerity. Again, the ethical demand, properly conceived, is not that we fixate ourselves in an objective love for another person, but rather that our concrete love express our transcendence, and this is not impossible. Sartre's analysis does not justify the conclusion that sincerity or good faith within the moral life is impossible, but only that good faith, when adequately understood, involves antitheses held together in what Kierkegaard termed passion. It would be silly to conclude that because of the antitheses involved in human existence, that to exist is impossible. And it would be no less foolish to persuade oneself that since the moral life involves antithetical elements, that it too is impossible. Faithfulness, which Kierkegaard properly regards as the basic ethical category involved, is not a simple or immediate idea. It is, as Kierkegaard maintained, a category of spirit and, in fact, the supreme ethical category. Unlike sincerity, as Sartre analyzes it, faithfulness requires the passionate and unconditional affirmation of the self as a unity, a dialectical unity of opposites. Even as time is a dialectical unity of flux and form, so is the ethical life a unity of concrete particularity with universal ideality. The moral life, then, is no less complex, ambiguous, or dialectical than human existence itself. Once the ethical good is redefined and the ethical task re-examined to take this fact into account, Sartre's indictment loses its force. Good faith, conceived of as self-coincidence, then gives way, as it must give way, to faithfulness, viewed as that unity of volition and action in which the individual forges a complex unity of the tensed factors which constitute his existence. Whatever else the ethical life may involve, it requires the unconditional choice of oneself. One wills, then, not simply to be the naturally given self or an ideally posited self, but the synthesis within which each term is qualified by the other while retaining its essential meaning. The self is the relation which relates itself to itself, and not the terms of the relation merely. It can will itself in its totality with what Kierkegaard called purity of heart. And to will oneself with this purity is the essence of faithfulness as contrasted with sincerity. On such a view of the ethical life, the antitheses are incorporated within the statement of the ethical good. The negativity and alienation which are ruinous to the life of immediacy, which Sartre was criticizing, become constitutive features of the dialectically formulated ethical ideal. Bad faith, which testifies to the inadequate appropriation of the ethical ideal and serves as the inevitable correlate of a naively formulated sincerity, gives way to the notion of faithfulness. The answer to Sartre is, in a way, a remarkably simple one, namely that one can choose oneself by moving in opposite directions at the same time. This answer does not get rid of the fact that one is, for example, both a waiter and not a waiter, both the lover of X and not the lover of X, though it does suggest a positive and non-cynical way of appropriating this negation. Now, I do not pretend to have done more than suggest a way out of the difficulty. The idea of bad faith, which is closely related to Kierkegaard's notion of despair, is, I think, extremely useful as a critical tool for the analysis of ethical feelings. Whatever the tensions and polarities which may be exhibited in human life, the self is, after all, a unity. What we have learned through Kant and since Kant is that it is neither a natural nor a simple unity. Ethics is possible and necessary only because man is not an immediate unity and hence can find no resolution of his problems within the context of immediacy. There is and can be, as Kierkegaard puts it, echoing both Kant and Hegel, no immediate health of the spirit. Bad faith, taken simply in itself, reflects the negativity, or put in other terms, the non-immediate character of the self. If this is all that it indicates, we are faced with no insuperable problem. As Sartre suggests, the individual may play upon this negativity in such a way as to exploit it, in which case bad faith is no longer merely a fact of existence. But he need not do that, as Sartre seems to recognize in a significant footnote. The individual is not the self he wills to become in an immediate sense, but this does not relieve him of the possibility or the responsibility of becoming that self in a non-immediate or dialectical way. Cynical disillusionment is far easier than acceptance of the full responsibility of ethical striving. But despair over the ethical life is by no means inevitable, provided one is willing to accept its magnitude and complexity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schrader. Professor Schrader has consented to a short discussion period where he will answer your questions from the floor. Dr. Schrader, you mentioned man's not only being a waiter, but being a person. And I would like to know what manifestations would one find of a person not only being a waiter, not only being what the world sees him or as he sees himself, but as being a person.
Yeah. Well, my point was this. I didn't say I would answer your question, but I would certainly consider them. I'm not sure that I'll answer any of them. You see, I think there's something perverse about Sartre, in spite of the brilliance of his analysis. That is, he suggests that no one can be a waiter in the sense in which, to use his own kind of an example, a stone is a stone. And yet that's perhaps the ordinary view of sincerity. You see that the waiter should be a waiter and only a waiter. If he fails to do that, then he's simply cynical. On the other hand, if he tries to do it, you see, he's naive, incredibly naive, and is bound to fail. Now, I think Sartre very nicely sets up the problem of what might be termed an authentic human existence. It is that the task is really that, I think, of accepting one's work and one's daily activities, if you like, as essential, as something that one must identify oneself with, but yet in such a way as to make them an expression of one's freedom. That's the trick. And I don't think Sartre shows that can't be done. All he shows is, I think, that it's a tricky business, that if one is going to make one's work the vehicle of one's freedom, he has to be very clever about it. He has to have he has to do it with some self-consciousness of his freedom. But I don't think Sartre points out that he can't do it, you see. In other words, what one wants to do, let us say if one is a waiter, I suppose one wants to find a device, and I think many waiters do, a device of performing this work, taking it seriously, not spilling the soup down people's back and so on, not being altogether obstreperous and impudent, while at the same time using that work as a way of expressing one's individuality as a person. Now, I leave it to your judgment, but I think we all know that many people do this. Not all waiters are wooden. Not all faithful or conscientious waiters are wooden. They don't become robots. They do manage to use the work as the vehicle for an expression of their person. Now, that means, of course, that they're always a waiter, but also more than a waiter, I think, in the process of carrying out this activity. That's what I meant to say, and I'm not sure it's clear. But I think I admit Sartre's point right off myself, that if we're trying for a simple coincidence and for a sincerity in that sense, which many virtuous people have thought they were striving toward, this is in the nature of the case impossible. And if we don't become sophisticated about it, we're, I think, under the ban that Sartre has suggested. This is at least what I meant. Yes?
You qualified your qualification in your previous qualification of free will, instructing orientation. I noticed that you tagged on a phrase.
I don't think I used it. I talked about freedom. I don't know I used the term free will, did I? That's your term, I believe. Now, what is it?
I thought that you spoke to the point of the for itself in terms of the fulfillment of a free will.
I don't believe I did.
Or a freedom.
I don't recall having said that, did I? What is it you're troubled about?
My trouble was...
Regardless of what I said.
I thought I understood you to use this term. But I wonder then if you didn't use the term, in what respect you wanted to speak of the for itself.
Well, I don't particularly want to speak about it. I was only using it as Sartre uses it. In other words, Sartre says, and I think he's absolutely right, that there are several modalities echoing Hegel here, that I exist in with a kind of a givenness. I'm factually determined as having this particular body and these particular potentialities, these powers and capacities, but it's equally essential to me as a human being that I aspire to achieve certain objectives of one sort or another. In other words, I'm anticipating what I'll do tomorrow. I'm anticipating the rest of my answer to you, if it is an answer, and so on. And I live in this gap between what he terms my facticity and my being for myself, you see, my self-consciousness, which is projective in character. Now, if one agrees with this, that is, if one looks upon man as a kind of dialectical unity with a fundamental, what Hegel terms, negativity that is intrinsic to his being, then this poses problems, conspicuous problems, you see, for the moral life. That's what I was talking about. You see, I tried to tie these together. That is, I'm admitting, I'm willing to accept the argument without trying to plead the case here, that man is a complex being, that one of the unique features of human existence is that it has this, what I call, dialectical character. Now, if that's the case, it seems to me to follow that these dialectical categories and these dialectical characters will inevitably intrude into the moral life and thus make being a good man much more complex than perhaps even sophisticated philosophers, even like Kant, whom I have very great respect and admiration, but a good deal more complex than many have thought. And now I think the usefulness of Sartre's analysis and Kierkegaard's analysis is, I think, to put their finger on this point and suggest that perhaps a more adequate statement of the nature of man will also require revision in our conception of ethics and the realizability of ethical ideals. But nonetheless, one still has to keep in mind the fact that to some degree Sartre, not entirely, but to some degree Sartre sets up a straw man. Not entirely, because there are self-righteous people. That is, there are two kinds of people. You see, there are cynical people and there are self-righteous people, and this is not, this is a matter of fact, and there have always been. Maybe there always will be. So it's not entirely a straw man. But I don't think he proves at all that there's no alternative to this kind of naive moral self-righteousness on the one hand, or perhaps an enlightened moral consciousness which is inevitably cynical. You see, that's the way he tends to leave one. There is a little footnote in the book which he never really, in Being a Nothingness, which he never develops or expands and leaves a complete mystery, in which he suggests there's a way out, but one's left to guess what it is, and I think it must be something like this if there is a way out. Yes?
Professor, would you consider a spontaneous act? And if so,
Sure.
would this be an act of force?
Well, a spontaneous act would be, I would suppose this would fall into the category of natural immediacy. This would be, we always like to think of this, for example, as innocence. And I suppose that insofar as we ever approach this, that perhaps there is a kind of immediacy, this spontaneity, a kind of immediacy that falls outside of moral categories. I've been talking about that. I've been talking about the moral life all the way through, where we certainly have posited the notions of good and evil, and we're beyond innocence. As has often been pointed out by moralists, as soon as you entertain the idea of good or evil, you're beyond innocence. I mean, you see, this is the old myth of eating of the tree of the apple of the tree of knowledge and so on. As soon as this is part of the riddle, you see, and part of the paradox, that the task of ethics in a way is to get rid of it, because to be aware of good is to know you can do evil. And how can you get yourself out of the predicament? Well, in a way, you want to eliminate ethics, so it's only possible to do good. And ethics makes possible, as we know so well, not only doing good, but doing evil. You might even say, you see, one of the interesting consequences is that as you have developed moral theories with beautiful conceptions of the good life, corollary to every conception of the good life is also a conception of a terribly, terribly evil life. I don't see any way to avoid that. And this is a curious paradox. This is one reason, of course, why some people think it's better not to have any philosophy or any reasoning, because you get farther and farther away from this so-called natural state of innocence. But on the other hand, you can't keep yourself in innocence except in bad faith. That is, you're just pretending to be an innocent. You're never really innocent. Once you get out of it, you're just out of it, and you either have to remain in this kind of a cynical state of pretense or go on, you see. So is that enough to dispose of this immediacy?
You wouldn't be innocent in treating it in a more metaphysical.
Oh, I would be, but not in this context. That wouldn't be ethically. That wouldn't be so important ethically. Now, I suppose, you see, insofar as these spontaneous acts occur, they just occur, I suppose. We can't plan them, or they wouldn't be spontaneous. And ethical action, ordinarily, we think of it as something that's deliberative and reflective, and that takes place through some exercise of the human mind, and perhaps even the agency of the will, whatever that is, and so on. Now, spontaneous acts occur, perhaps. I think this is actually a limiting concept, because I doubt there's any pure spontaneity, but insofar as it does, it just occurs, and, well, that's a big story as to how to relate that to ethics. I haven't attempted to discuss that question here, but it is terribly important to note that there's often nostalgia in our conception of ethics. That is, what we really want is a kind of goodness that has this character of immediacy, spontaneity, and so on. And that, of course, is impossible in the nature of the case. That's part of the whole predicament. That is, how can you plan something in such, and how can this planned action ever have the quality that you really want, namely of the spontaneous goodness, let us say, of the uncorrupted, naive child, or the uncorrupted, naive person, perhaps Adam in the Garden of Eden before Eve brought the apple around, you see. And this is, of course, part of the very kind of paradox that I've been attempting to discuss this evening.
Professor, isn't that true only because you make a distinction between spontaneity and the other forms of action?
Well, but I don't think I just make it or pull it out of the hat. I think it's been around for a long time. I think it's simply that human beings actually are reflective and are, shall we say, self-conscious and so on, and therefore we have to make the distinction if we're going to talk about Minotaur.
You assume the distinction.
Well, I don't. Yes, indeed. I assume that there's something to be distinguished. Otherwise, I'd be talking through my hat, which maybe I am, but I don't mean to be. That is, I assume here that in most cases that one is introducing a word or a set of terms or set of categories in order to describe or characterize something that we're aware of, and aware of even without being philosophers or anything of the sort. And this is, I think, quite an ancient thing, and something that develops, I think, quite early, even in the life of individuals as well as within the life of civilization.
In the light of the great admiration for Kant and your mention of his duty in connection with ethics, have you given any validity to Albert Camus?
Any validity to him?
Yes.
Well, yes, but that's a long story. Well, yes, I think Camus is, well, if I say just one or two things about Camus, I think Camus, well, it might be interesting to consider him in the light of this discussion, because as I look upon Camus, he's above all else a frustrated rationalist. That is, he looks upon man, I think, in human life as being absurd, really, because it fails to fulfill very elevated and sublime conceptions of reason and rationality, and so on. I think one has to recognize this, the standard that Camus is using, perhaps even as it applies to the moral life, in order to see why he really does tend to look upon the human situation as so absurd. Now, if one doesn't hold to this terribly pure, even absolute conception of what reason is, I think one doesn't have to follow through with it to the conclusions that to which Camus arrives. But it would be a long story, I think, to consider in detail. Is there any particular point you had in mind as far as Camus? Well, of course, Camus has been very much concerned with the paradoxes of the moral life. He's been concerned with the question of whether we can, as it were, reconcile the tensions, oppositions, and so on, whether we can reconcile reason with the facts of existence and so on. And of course, as you know, he came to some fairly pessimistic conclusions. But that occurs, I think, rather much within the context of the problem, as Sartre and Kierkegaard and others have described it. Yes?
Before, about the possibility of man doing something for the ideal, and not in response to the need of another.
Yes.
And I think we probably have resolved your concluding remarks by saying that this is perhaps another ambiguity, perhaps, which results in abnormality, which results from or a false conception of what morality is. My own point of view would be that the average person does not go through his moral life trying to attain ideals. I think he goes through his life having to reconcile what he would like to do with what he must do. He's answering the bell, so to speak.
Well,
there may be principles, there may be ideals operating, but he's not trying to fulfill an ideal. So
well, he's not. Yes, he's ordinarily. Yes, he doesn't follow through his principles to their logical conclusion. I grant that. I was saying that. Well, no, maybe he's wiser than many philosophers there. You know, you often find students. I've often found students in ethics courses, or one not even in ethics courses, saying, well, when they read some philosophical or other conception of the good life, well, that's fine, but it's too ideal. And I've often been puzzled by that, you see. How can anything be too ideal, especially an ideal? How can an ideal be too ideal? And yet one finds people saying that, not only students who are studying philosophy, but the so-called ordinary men, which means all non-philosophers. And yet there's a point, you see. There's a point, I think, in saying this, and perhaps what it may reflect, if we credit it with wisdom now, which we should in all charity, what it presumably reflects is a sensitivity to these polarities. In other words, I think there is a fairly general recognition that even though we need to formulate rules and laws, that we shouldn't give the man the drink of water simply in order to be faithful to the law. Indeed, that there's something perhaps even perverse about that we should give him a drink of water because he's a human being who's thirsting, and is going to die of thirst, we don't give him a drink of water. So that we have a puzzle on our hands, and this, of course, is terribly interesting when it's either formulated in terms of an ethical theory or when we begin to reflect upon it philosophically. And I think this tension is, of course, present in the life even of the ordinary man. But I would certainly agree that he does, in fact, that's what one thing I meant to say. You see, you can't conclude that because human existence involves paradoxes that men can't exist, because they do. Similarly, you can't say that because the moral life is a terribly complex and dialectical affair that men don't exist and live, indeed, solve moral problems, because they do. But yeah.
Is that you created a false dichotomy, creating a false problem. In other words,
no, I don't think so. Although I grant that it's an extreme case. But you see, there's a typical neurosis. There is a typical neurosis which Karen Horney, who's a psychiatrist, analyzes. This is a typical one. And I expect there's no one here who hasn't manifest some semblance of this kind of neurosis. You see, namely of just being angry with oneself because one didn't do what one ought to do. For example, you should quit smoking, and you didn't quit, and you're mad at yourself, and you punish yourself, or this, that, or the other thing, typical. Well, now, if you apply that to the whole of your personality, and not only take that one isolated thing seriously for a little while, but take all of your moral rules seriously, then you may very well and inevitably will come to the point where you not only want to kick yourself a little bit now, but where you really are totally disgusted with yourself and have a complete self-hatred. And this is really a neurosis, a very common one, which in one degree or another is exhibited all around us, and which I submit we all have something like every time we want to kick ourselves for not doing what we ought to do, you see. Now, all right, if you wanted...
Because we let somebody down, we disappointed somebody, we didn't do what would be best for ourselves. Not because...
No, I think you missed the point. It's a very subtle point here, and at least I think it is. You see, the point is this, that, for example, well, I mean, you know there are people that don't write books because the book that they want to write is such a perfect one that the first word they put down would compromise it. It might have smudged ink on the typewriter. And you couldn't write it, could you? Or you might get the wrong first word. Wouldn't this be horrible? Because the book you're going to write is the perfect book. Well, now you see what happens, and this actually happens. It happens to all of us. I'm speaking partly from personal experience here. This happens to all of us all the time, you see, that the more you perfect your ideal, you see, it may be the farther you move away from the possibility of taking a step in the direction of that idea. Don't you see the connection? The connection is that the very refinement and perfection of the ideal makes the implementation of the ideal, and thus the functioning of the ideal as an ideal, more and more unfeasible. Now, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Well, one thing you can do about it, there are a number of things you could do, but one thing you can do is to refuse to give up this perfect ideal because you identify with it. This is the self you want to be, namely the one that's going to do the perfect thing. It doesn't do it in practice, but it does it in principle. But how are you going to, but the only way you can be that self is, of course, by humiliating the other part of yourself. In other words, you have to be the self that doesn't put a single word down. And so there you are, you see, in this situation of having constantly to humiliate yourself, but humiliate yourself for the sake of your ideality. You see what I mean? Now, this is a very, very common human phenomenon. Well, I don't want to carry. Look. Let's don't worry about the average man because we can't decide what he is. I would be quite content to say yes, but I would only want to say that I think that such phenomena as the one I'm just now discussing are quite commonplace. Quite commonplace. I suggested that there is, I think, and I cite Horney's analysis, which I think fills this bill. There is, I suggest, not only a fairly garden variety experience of the sort I've mentioned, but also a typical, commonplace kind of neurotic behavior which manifests this relation to ideals. That's all I want to say. So I don't want to say that necessarily this is something, a condition that holds universally and so on, but I think it does operate much more than you would ever think, even in the case of the gardener next door or the other person and so on. Were there some other questions? Yes.
Would it be an oversimplification of your view to say that you have resolved the paradox of striving for moral perfection and necessarily being involved in bad faith in striving for moral perfection by redefining moral perfection as a synthesis, a dialectical synthesis? And if so, is it purely a matter of definition that you have equated moral perfection with synthesis, or is this a factual identification?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I hope it's not merely a matter of shifting terms. That is, I think the problem of ethics, after all, in its origin and at all times, is really concerned with existing. That the projects of ethics or the ethical theories and so on only try to focus and define man's effort really to achieve his own possibilities and, if you like, really to become himself. In other words, this is not to be separated at any point from the universal human concern really to exist. You see, this is man's supreme and overriding and constant and inescapable responsibility, namely the responsibility of existing. Now, I think what has happened is that ethical theories on the whole tended to emphasize the ideal factor. And in emphasizing the ideal factor, you see, they left out other factors, and thus, in actual fact, the ethically defined good had elements within it that really of what we could only call, I think, evil. I agree here with Hegel that we could only call them actually evil. For example, in Kant's case, to take the one that's dearest to my own heart, with all of the sublimity of the moral law. You see, Kant says that there are two things, the moral law and the starry heavens above, you see, that fill him with awe. But he's so carried away with this notion of a universal law that he tends, you see, to take all too negative a view of the particular and the concrete, you see. Now, I think the thing I want to say is this, and here would be my justification for saying that I think it's not a mere shifting of terms. You have to show, and I think you can show, that the very moral value of the law, as Kant defines it, depends upon the particular. You see? In other words, if you recognize why Kant postulated the moral law as the supreme principle of ethics, you realize that it's the law to govern particulars. And you have to understand the context in which it's first formulated and so on. So that I think that if one can, if you like, examine any particular conception of the good and see, you see, whether or not it's complete in and of itself, whether or not it implies some paradoxical feature, or whether it implies some kind of inner contradiction and so on. In other words, I think the correction has to come from within the statement. I think you have to find that within the theory itself there's an incompleteness. And you can do it with Kant's theory by examining, you see, the relation of the universal to the particular. You can do it with Plato's theory by analyzing the relation of the passions or the appetites to reason, or the ideal to the actual and so on. But you have to do it from within each theory. You see what I mean? You have to see what the theory is trying to say, what it's designed for, and when you examine it, I think you do find the principles for its own correctness. And that's at least the way in which I would want to avoid just coming in from the outside and manipulating things around and saying, well, no, let's use the terms this way rather than that, and so on. In other words, I want to say this, that if Kant is to say this, then he's got to say more. He has, in his definition of the good, he's posed a problem about the good. And I think I can show it. Similarly by Plato, that if you say the good is this, well, then what do you say about these other factors that are necessarily involved in the good and so on? You see, that's at least the way. Now, to do it adequately, of course, would mean that one would have to make a careful and detailed examination of each of these ethical theories. And I certainly haven't attempted to do that here. But that's the way I think one would have to avoid that particular dilemma. Yes?
I was wondering if, to use your own expression, we have to say more. You discovered or the dialecticity is a characteristic of moral. Presumably, dialecticity would operate on other grounds also.
Yes.
Now, would you want to go so far then as to embrace all these instances of dialecticity in the kind of global working out the dialectic, such as to lead you to embrace Hegel's absolute spirit?
Oh, well, I wouldn't be so ambitious as that myself, no. Well, that is a, you see, I say in the end of my paper, now, if you want to stay long enough, I'd be glad to make a few feeble efforts in that direction, although I don't claim to have Hegel's genius, and I'm sure I couldn't give you a bird's eye picture of the absolute. I don't have one. But I think if one is willing to be more modest and look, let us say, to man, I think one can make some progress there. That is to say, I think we can have a relatively complete, or if not complete, at least schematic view of man in his wholeness, and we can see, I think, the way in which all the various empirical and rational and other factors do enter into the total life of the existing individual, and I think that we can at least approach an adequate philosophical or other statement of the factors and so on, and indeed the way that they are actually held together in the various moments of man's striving. But to do this as far as the absolute is concerned, I think is an extremely difficult thing, and there I think we perhaps can't get beyond conjecture there. I don't have any great confidence in the possibility of having an absolute view of the absolute. I think we can only have a finitistic view of the absolute, not an absolute view of the absolute. With all my admiration for Hegel, I must say I can't quite share his enthusiasm at that point.
Well, that's my point. I agree with you. These dialectical explanations make it good. Deals a great deal. But if you don't want to go along with a projection out of what you need in absolute, how do you avoid that?
Well, you can't avoid it.
Stringing your dialectic out to this kind of all-encompassing denial of existence.
All right. You can't leave the absolute out, because you're always entangled with it if you like. That is to say, you can't leave out the reference, let us say, to yourself of the whole of reality that you're always ensnared with. It's just always there. And you do have to say something about it, take it into account, and so on. But that's a very big story. I mean, how you begin to take it into account. This involves your relation to nature. It involves your relation to God. It involves your relation to the state and everything else. And you can say something significant about this. I've only mentioned it. You see, I point out that I think man does have a problem because he has a social meaning. He has a meaning to others. And he has a meaning to himself, and these are often terribly diverse. He may appear, there's always been a riddle, you see, is it better to seem than be good, or better to be than seem good, or can you be and seem good in the same way? And this is, of course, a very elementary problem that everybody knows about. We hear so much about it in these days of other and interdirectedness, etc., the many ways in which it's put. And, of course, one has to have a conception, one has to take into account these various relations, other directed relations to the world and all the objects and things in the world and so on. And they make the dialectic, what I've called the dialectic here, you see, much more complex than it would be if one concerned only oneself. Now, I say Kierkegaard, I think, is perhaps too limited in his reference because he's talking about inwardness and subjectivity, the truth of subjectivity, without considering adequately the way in which I may be in a mode of untruth with myself because of my, what we might term a disrelationship to others. In other words, if I'm deceiving others, or in some way, either because I can't help it or because I do it deliberately, I'm dissembling toward others, then this is inevitably, I think, reflected in my relation to myself, because my relation to others is a relation that I have also to myself. So this is certainly a problem that has to be dealt with. I only plead shortness of time and completeness of the paper here, but it's something that I think one can deal with, and I think short of absolute knowledge. Yes?
Becoming is the fundamental category, you said, that really infects all of man's existence. In what sense can you speak of the self, the realization of the self, the fulfillment of the self? In what sense can you even make an assertion of about the self.
Well, I
about
think
the non-self.
yes. Well, that's because I wouldn't want to. That's because I think becoming has a structure. That is, it is. I think becoming is the fundamental category, and I think even the statements we make, I think even philosophical categories have a way of shifting. I think that there's perhaps there's no philosophical category that I think has quite the same meaning.
You mean becoming fits into the category of being?
Oh, I think it does. I think even using the category of becoming, I think this perhaps becomes. So that I still think that becoming is the fundamental category, but it's not such a structureless becoming. It's not such a, if you like, it's not an amorphous kind of becoming, and therefore we can analyze it, describe it, categorize it, and so on. But I think even our philosophical statements, nonetheless, do take place. We make them, as it were, while we're in motion. That is, I'm trying to think now. I take it you are, you see, and we try to engage with Plato's thinking in the historical process. I think that the context within which man lives is always the historical context. It's as a being, you can't think unless you're in motion, really, because thought is more form of motion, but it's not unstructured. And I don't think that becoming and structure are incompatible. The only way that I think you run into a terrible dilemma there is if you're thinking of some kind of completely atemporal structure that is in no way amenable to process or becoming, and I don't think of it in that way. So I think you can handle this process of this ancient problem, of course, of process and form, of flux and form, with certainly without adopting a pure Heraclitean flux, which I don't mean to use becoming in that sense.
Well, to the extent to which it does have some structure, wouldn't this militate against some of the analyses that the
well, I think yes and no. I think that I would agree here certainly with Kant and Hegel and a good many others that there is, if you like, there are a priori conditions, thus limits within which human existence transpires. I think that as philosophers, one of the things we want to do, even if we recognize freedom, we want to analyze the structure of freedom and the conditions of freedom. And so I'm perfectly happy to talk about the conditions of man's becoming. I think it's not unconditioned freedom. It's not limitless freedom. I don't think freedom is possible without limits, without conditions, if you like, without an a priori, without categories and so on. So I'm perfectly happy to talk about those. I think you're only in a difficulty if you try to talk about some kind of absolutely unlimited, amorphous kind of freedom or becoming or something of that sort.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
You've spoken of the dialectical nature of the ethical self,
Yes.
the ethical goals. But don't you think that the absolute or the ethical goal itself subordinates all the dialectic? Like in the case of Kierkegaard, the absolute theos subordinates the relativity or the dialectical nature of ethics. Everything's subordinated to the absolute theos, which is God or is.
Yes, but that has the inner structure even of faith for Kierkegaard is a dialectical one, you see. After all, I've taken quite a few suggestions here from Kierkegaard, and I think he takes quite a few from Hegel. That is, the faith itself for Kierkegaard, in which you have this absolute telos, is by no means immediacy. Heaven help us for Kierkegaard. I mean, you know his view of immediacy. And he had a very dim view of even religious immediacy. In fact, it's almost, one sometimes wonders if he hasn't made faith such a complex affair that only someone of his sophisticated intellect and imagination could hold it, as he does, and that's quite possible. But in any case, this, you recall how he describes faith in this very elliptical and complicated way as an uncertainty held fast in the passion of inwardness, etc., this beautiful statement. Well, that's a very complex statement, and is by no means a description of some simple, immediate phenomenon. So what I want to say is that even within faith for Kierkegaard, there is intrinsic to that, as the structural features, antitheses, a negativity, you see, and dialectical tension, so that this is, if you like, his answer to Sartre. That is, Kierkegaard does have an answer, because he says there's no immediate health of the spirit. All views of man and all views of ethics, etc., which predicate this, which many have, that there is an immediate health of the spirit, these have too elementary a conception of man. So I think that there one certainly does have, in Kierkegaard, a solution, if you like, which depends upon an internal dialectical structure. Yeah.